Good morning. Good to see everyone this morning. I know we got some vacationers, but I think God probably will forgive them. If I get a vacation this year, He'll forgive them. If not, I'm going to talk to Him. Just teasing. If you're a guest with us, I do that sometimes. But I talked last week about 5 smooth stones, and what I really talked about was in all of our lives there are giants. In all of our lives there are these obstacles, and sometimes they just seem too big. They seem too hard to handle. And I named a few possibilities last week. I talked about sometimes we have the giant of physical problems, maybe physical ailments or a doctor's report, even sometimes terminal physical conditions. There is the giant of debt that sits in a lot of our houses and in a lot of our organizations, whether it's churches or our businesses that are forced to confront very difficult and quite honestly painful financial situations. For some of us, it's relational. It's marriages that don't work like we thought they would or didn't work out like we thought they would. It's children that are estranged from us, or parents that were absentee, or fathers or mothers that walked away, or a number of these things are obstacles and they're giants and they come into our lives. We talked about how to defeat them. But I'm going to talk to you about something today that probably you've never heard anyone talk about. Because I want to talk about fighting the wrong giant. I want to talk about a giant that the nation of Israel confronted and killed that they never should have faced. They never should have killed him. They never should have ever met him. And I want to talk about sometimes in our lives, it's quite possible we're fighting big battles and fighting big giants that we never should have met. That were never within God's plan for us that we face that giant. And in this particular one, I want to start the story in Deuteronomy 3. Now, Deuteronomy let me just give you a quick overview of the book of Deuteronomy, because the book of Exodus is all about, well, what the word says, the Exodus. It's about the children of Israel who had been slaves for 400 years, being delivered by God, and a man named Moses leading them out. And then the rest of Exodus and Leviticus and Numbers all tell about this journey they went on through the wilderness, trying to get to this land that God had promised to. Their nation began with a man named Abraham and his son Isaac, and then Isaac's son Jacob, and these what were called the patriarchs. And they had lived in this place that's now called Canaan when the Israelites were in slavery. And so God has promised this land, though, to Abraham and his grandson Jacob, whose name was changed to Israel. And so those 3 books, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, tell the story of this journey, this 40-year journey. Deuteronomy, though, is a little different. Deuteronomy is a series of sermons or letters that Moses wrote, and it is when they have come to what's called the plains of Moab, and they're sitting waiting to cross into the promised land. And Moses is an old man now, and God has said, you're not going to take them on. So Moses sits down, and basically the book of Deuteronomy, he recaps what has happened over these last 40 years of this journey. And then he gives them some instructions again. He really reiterates the instructions that God gave them 40 years earlier at Mount Sinai when He gave the 10 Commandments and all of the different laws. But in the early part of Deuteronomy, he's retelling the story. He's reminding them. So I want to start in Deuteronomy 3, verse 1. Moses said, "Next we turned and headed for the land of Bashan, where King Og and his entire army attacked us. But the Lord told me, do not be afraid of them. For I have given you victory over Og and his entire army, and I will give you all his land. Treat him just as you treated King Sihon of the Amorites, who ruled in Heshbon." And they had just faced the Amorites and King Sihon and had killed all of them. So the Lord our God handed King Og and all his people over to us, and we killed them all. Not a single person survived. We conquered all 60 of his towns, the entire region in his kingdom of Bashan. Not a single town escaped our conquest. These towns were all fortified with high walls and barred gates. We also took many unwalled villages at the same time. We completely destroyed the kingdom of Bashan, just as we had destroyed King Sihon of Heshbon. And he goes on to talk about we killed all the people. We took the livestock and the plunder for ourselves. And then verse 11, King Og of Bashan was the last survivor of the giant Rephaites. His bed was made of iron. He was more than 13 feet. The bed was more than 13 feet long and 6 feet wide. Now, I like a big bed. In fact, I've often said a king-size bed is the only reason I can be married. because when I'm ready to sleep, I'd like to pretend I'm the only person on the entire planet. But I don't have a 13-foot long bed. So suffice to say, this man is the last of the giants of this particular race. So this sounds like a great victory, doesn't it? It sounds like God gave them victory. They destroyed all these towns. They faced an army that was probably larger than them, more than likely better trained than them, and yet God gave them this miraculous victory. Seems every bit as important as David and Israel defeating Goliath and the Philistines. Seems like, wow, this was a real seminal moment for the nation of Israel, a real thing to hang their hat on. And certainly God did miraculously enable this group of former slaves who had never been trained in war, to defeat this giant and all his army. But I'd make the argument that they never should have met this giant. And I want to back up just a little bit to the beginning of Deuteronomy. I've already kind of set the scene. I told you Deuteronomy is basically the recap of what's been going on the last 40 years. And it begins by saying, these are the words that Moses spoke to all the people of Israel while they were in the wilderness east of the Jordan River. They were camped in the Jordan Valley near Suph, between Paran on one side and Tophel. He names some towns with funny names. Verse 2, listen to this. Normally it only takes 11 days to travel from Mount Sinai to Kadesh Barnea, going by the way of Mount Seir. But 40 years after the Israelites left Egypt, on the first day of the 11th month, Moses addressed the people of Israel, telling them everything God had commanded him to say. This took place after he had defeated King Sihon of the Amorites and had defeated King Og of Bashan, who ruled in Ashtoreth. What happened? Now, I put this map up. I know it's a little small, but I have my handy-dandy laser pointer, and I want to show you. Here's Mount Sinai. Now, when the Egyptians released and said, please don't let the door hit you on the way out, to the Israelites, they went to Mount Sinai, which was just a few-day journey, a 3-day journey, I think it was, to go and worship. And Mount Sinai is down here in what we now call the Sinai Peninsula, oddly enough. And they came down here and they spent a period of time there. They spent, I think, 40 days there while God gave them the law, and they built a gold cow in the meantime. And if you're familiar with that story at all, this was the real moment. In other words, keep in mind that the law that God gave to Moses on Mount Sinai was and still is Israel's constitution. This was the making of a nation. This was the forming of a government. Up to this point, it was a family. But now this was the forming of a government. This was a huge moment. God gives them their constitution just like we have ours. Now, from there, I'm going to read on a little bit because we've got them right now at Mount Sinai. Verse 6, because I was still trying to figure out how it took 40 years. When we were at Mount Sinai, the Lord our God said to us, you've stayed at this mountain long enough. It is time to break camp and move on. Go to the hill country of the Amorites and to all the neighboring regions, the Jordan Valley, the hill country, the western foothills, the coastal plain. Go to the land of the Canaanites. In other words, he tells them what the promised land is. And he basically says it's from Egypt all the way over to the great river Euphrates, which is just off of here. He says, go straight up. This is it. You see Jerusalem, Jericho, Gilgal, Beersheba. The promised land is described as from Dan in the north to Beersheba. So you can see where God tells them to go, straight up here to what's now Israel. Look, I'm giving all this land to you. Go in and occupy it, for it is the land the Lord swore to give to your ancestors, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. There's those three. And to their descendants. Then, just as the Lord commanded us, we left Mount Sinai and traveled through the great and terrifying wilderness, as you yourselves remember, and headed toward the hill country of the Amorites. When we arrived at Kadesh Barnea, I said to you, you've now reached the hill country of the Amorites that the Lord our God is giving us. Moses goes on then and says, look, He's placed the land in front of you. Go and occupy it, as the Lord, the God of our ancestors, has promised. Don't be afraid. Don't be discouraged. But you came to me and said, first let's send scouts to explore the land for us. They will advise us on the best route to take and which towns we should enter. Moses goes on. Most of you guys know this story, but you might not. Verse 26, but you rebelled against the command of the Lord your God and refused to go in. In other words, in 11 days roughly, they've gone from Mount Sinai to right here, and they're at the threshold of their promised land. And God, through Moses, says, go take it. I've given it to you. I promised it to Abraham, and I'm not going to break my promise now. Go take it. It belongs to you. They say, we probably ought to get a second opinion. In fact, we ought to get 12 second opinions. And so they send 12 guys in. But you rebelled against the command of the Lord your God, refused to go, and you complained in your tents and said, the Lord must hate us. That's why He's brought us from here to Egypt to hand us over to the Amorites to be slaughtered. Where can we go? Our brothers have demoralized us with their report. They tell us, and here's what the spies said to them. I want you to catch this because I want you to see why they didn't go in. The people of the land are taller and more powerful than we are, and their towns are large, with walls rising high into the sky. We even saw giants there, the descendants of Anak. Moses tries to talk them into it. Joshua and Caleb, two of the spies, jump in and go, hey guys, we can handle this. God's handled all kinds of other stuff. He parted a Red Sea. He took care of the most powerful army on earth. He can handle these guys. They don't want any of it. And in verse 32, Moses said, even after all he did, you refused to trust the Lord your God. And that leads to some of the saddest words in the entire Bible. I know I'm reading a lot to you, but I'm trying to set the background here. And that is the beginning of the second chapter of Deuteronomy. It says, this is Moses, then we, Israel, turned around and headed back across the wilderness toward the Red Sea. Just as the Lord had instructed me, we wandered around the region of Mount Seir for a long time. In fact, they spend 38 years backpedaling. They spend 38 years between Kadesh Barnea and right there where you see Zered, the Wadi of Zered. It takes them 38 years. Now, it only takes 11 days to go from there to there. They spend 38 years going less distance. The other problem is they're going the wrong direction because the promised land's over here. They're on the threshold, and they turn around and go back toward the Red Sea that God already parted for them to come across, and back toward Egypt. In fact, they even tried to elect different leaders to take them back to Egypt. Now, I want to also read you just a little bit from Numbers 13 because that's the original story, only because I want you to again see why they said, what they really said was, we can't go into the promised land. It's too hard to do that. And for you and I, we might not have a country we're called on, but when I talk about the promised land, what I'm talking about is the life, the purpose God has for you and I. For a fulfilling the promise, fulfilling the potential, fulfilling the call that God's placed on our life. And He has for all of us. He didn't create any of us to be extra parts in case something broke. He didn't create any of us to just mark time until we died. He created all of us with a specific purpose. But for many of us, we've had a glimpse of, or we felt like we knew what that purpose was supposed to be, and we backed away. And it might have been some of the same reasons. So let me just real quickly read you just a little bit more out of Numbers 13, and then I'll stop reading, I promise. Numbers 13, verse 1, the Lord said to Moses, since the people think it's a good idea, send out men to explore the land of Canaan, the land I'm giving to the Israelites. Then verse 25, after exploring the land for 40 days, the men returned to Moses and Aaron and the whole community of Israel at Kadesh, right here, in the wilderness of Paran. They reported to the whole community what they had seen and showed them the fruit they had taken from the land. This was their report to Moses. We entered the land you sent us to explore. It is indeed a bountiful country, a land flowing with milk and honey. Here's the kind of fruit it produces. And they showed these massive grape bunches that were so big it took 2 people to carry them. But, here's that same word again, the people living there are powerful, and their towns are large and fortified. We even saw giants there, the descendants of Anak. So Israel faces a critical moment, a critical decision. If they choose to go forward, here's what the spies told them. If you choose to inherit your potential, if you choose to inherit your purpose, this is what you'll face. You'll face battles, you'll face obstacles, and you'll face giants. Right? People living there are powerful. In other words, you're going to have to fight. Their towns are large and fortified. There's going to be walls, there's going to be cities, there's going to be all kinds of other problems, Israel, let's face it, most of it is desert. So there's going to be thirsty and hungry and things like that. But also you're going to face giants. That strangely spells bog. And we kind of bog down sometimes when we face these. And so I don't know in your life what maybe you feel like God has called you, but I've been really challenged this week by this. And that is, I wonder if some of the giants I'm fighting and facing aren't on the way to where I'm supposed to be going. So Israel's faced with a crisis of faith. They're faced with a moment to make a decision. And in Israel's case, the people talking to them, the spies that had seen it, created an epidemic of unbelief. And they started to list all the things that could go wrong. And among them they said, they're big people, they're trained in battle, we're not. They'll end up killing us, and they'll take our daughters and sons and our wives for themselves and make captives of them. And God finally reaches the point, He's heard enough. And in Numbers 14 He says, you know what? You said your children would be carried off as plunder. You said you'd be defeated and killed. I'm going to let you have exactly that. But it's going to be in the wilderness, so turn around and go back the way you came so you don't have to face these battles, obstacles, and giants. Now, that may have happened for you in the past. I hope what will happen today for some of us is we'll look at this and go, you know what? I'm fighting some battles, obstacles, and giants that aren't on the way to what I really feel like my purpose is. So they turn around. Here's what I want to get across to you, though. They turn around and they go back. Now, I'm just going to give you a quick thumbnail of what the next 40 years were like. Because thank goodness they avoided these battles, obstacles, and giants, right? Because that's what they would have gotten if they went forward. So, Numbers 20, they ran out of water and grumbled. Numbers 21, a bunch of them are taken captive, so they have to go to war with a nation called the Canaanites. Still in Numbers 21, they get impatient with a long journey, and God sends poisonous snakes among them to bite them and kill them. Still in Numbers 21, they're attacked by King Sihon of the Amorites. Then, still in Numbers 21, they're attacked by King Og and the entire nation of Bashan. In Numbers 25, they fall into idolatry. They're led into by a king named Balak. And they end up having to fight a war after a bunch of them are killed for their idolatry by a plague. They have to fight a war to destroy Moab and kill this king. And then in Numbers 31, they go to war with 5 kings of Midian. Now, what did they just spend the last 40 years facing? Oh, y'all. Thank you. They still spent 40 years fighting battles, facing obstacles, and fighting giants. They just did it walking directly away from their destiny and circling round and round their destiny. I want to point out something else that's important, though, because this is where we'll fool ourselves sometimes, or this is where we'll think, well, this must be God's direction. I want to also give you a quick rundown of some of the things God did for them during these 40 years. God didn't just say, you're on your own, Hoss. Hope you like that choice you made. Let me tell you a few of the miracles God did during those same 40 years. Numbers 20, He provided water out of a rock. That didn't happen for me real lately. Numbers 21, they defeat the Canaanites and get back all of their captives. They also are attacked by the Amorites, a big war nation. God gives them victory. They're attacked by this giant, Og, and his entire nation. God gives them victory. Numbers 22 through 24, there's a donkey that talks to help them. There is a prophet that's called on and paid to prophesy against them. He prophesies for them 3 times. Numbers 25, they attack and destroy this nation of Moab. You can see right here, you've got the Moabites. The Ammonites, that's where King Sihon was. Bashan is where Og was. They're fighting all of these people. They're winning over and over. They're told, don't fight the Edomites. They're your brothers. But the Moabites, the Ammonites, the Termites, no, they're not up there, Bashan. And ultimately then, in Numbers 31, they go to war with 5 kings and all of their armies from Midian and defeat all of them. Then, Deuteronomy 8, Moses reminds them of something else. He says, remember how the Lord your God led you through the wilderness for these 40 years, testing you to prove your character and to find out whether or not you'd obey His commands. Yes, He humbled you by letting you go hungry and then feeding you with manna, a food previously unknown to you and your ancestors. So in the meantime, while they're walking the wrong direction from where God told them to go, He's still feeding them and providing for them. He did it to teach you that people do not live by bread alone. Rather, we live by every word that comes from the mouth of the Lord. For all these 40 years, your clothes didn't wear out and your feet didn't blister or swell. In other words, the whole time that they are walking away from God's plan, God's purpose for them, they're seeing miracles. There's water coming out of rocks, there's donkeys talking, there's victories over all of these nations, there's supernatural provision happening, and there's protection from not just these enemies, but from wear and tear and all of these things. They are seeing God. In fact, Moses lists 11 distinct examples of God's miraculous provision and protection for people who refused to obey Him and pursue His will for their lives. Now, that's pretty amazing, isn't it? God didn't quit loving them. And if you instinctively understand this, if you're a parent, and your child doesn't do what you had hoped, maybe you feel like they didn't accomplish all that they had the potential to accomplish. Maybe they're doing exactly the wrong thing and you know it. But you don't stop loving them. You don't disown them. And you don't say, well, I'll never feed you again. You still care. You still love them. You still provide for them. You don't see them playing in the street and go, well, it'll serve them right if they get run over. You still protect them. And this is where we get fooled sometimes, is we walk away from, or we somehow miss God's purpose He's placed in our heart, that dream, that thing, and you know what it is, because when He's placed it there, it doesn't ever go away. As you get older, you begin to rationalize why you never got to it, maybe. But that thing's there. But what will fool us sometimes is either the enemy's still fighting against us, because we do have an enemy, right? We would mostly all agree that on this earth, if we are God's children, that by its very nature makes us enemies with Satan. And he doesn't go, well, since you're not accomplishing everything, I'll just leave you alone. Then it doesn't work that way. So we go, well, I'm still fighting battles, so I'm getting resistance, so I must be accomplishing. And then we look around and God is still doing good stuff for us. God is still providing. God still brings miracles into our lives. He still helps us find resources we didn't know we had, make relationships we didn't have, see healing, physical or emotional or mental or relational happen in our lives. And we're going, wow, I must be really pleasing Him. And yet, they were wandering around in the direct opposite direction of God's destiny for them. And I wonder sometimes how many battles I've fought and how many miracles of God I've used up while I went round and round in circles instead of pursuing the thing because that giant, that obstacle, that battle looked too big and too hard. And I've come to this conclusion: whether or not you choose to embrace God's purpose, you will face battles, obstacles, and giants. Say, boy, what an edifying message. That's only the first point. The second point, you will also experience God's protection and provision. He doesn't say anywhere in the Bible, I will bless you and love you if you are in my perfect will. But anything outside of that, you're on your own. He basically says, and Moses reiterates this in Deuteronomy, if you obey me, if you live your life according to my moral, my code, for lack of a better word, but really if you live a life of pleasing God in terms of trying to live the life that He says you'll be blessed. Now, what that doesn't mean is necessarily that you'll only be blessed if you're in Canaan. You'll only be blessed if you're pursuing everything God put in front of you. But armed with those two statements, it leads to this question. Why does it matter what choice you make, right? Fighting battles either way. God's still with me either way. God's with me. God is with those people while they wandered around the wrong direction. Why does it really matter? Why does it matter if I pursue that thing that scares me to death? Because God, I know God had to say it because I would have never even thought that I could do that. Why should I encounter that giant when I can turn around and at least meet some different giants? It's because true life is only found in embracing God's purpose for your life. God made you, made me, knows us better than we know ourselves, knows exactly what brings joy to us, what brings pleasure, what brings fulfillment, what brings contentment, what brings productivity into our lives. He knows how we operate best. He knows how we think, how we feel. In fact, David writes about, before I was even born, all my days were written. You know a word before it's even on my tongue. God knows us so well that His purpose for us is ultimately not about just accomplishing His purpose, but it's about us living fulfilled, true lives. And that's at the end of the book of Deuteronomy. At the end of the book of Deuteronomy, Moses is sitting... can we go back to one of those maps? I don't care which one. Sorry. Moses and them are on what's called the plains of Moab, which are right in here. And you see Jericho across. They're across from Jericho. Mount Nebo is right in here. And this is where Moses dies. And right at the end of Deuteronomy, he is writing his final words to them. And they are sitting on the threshold. They're sitting in the same, it's not the same town. They're on the east side instead of the south side. Down here's Kadesh. But they are sitting, the next generation of Israelites are sitting with the same choice their parents had. Will you go? Will you face? And the very first thing they're going to face is a city with walls so thick they can ride multiple chariots side by side around. Will you go face the battles, the obstacles, and the giants? Or are you too going to turn around again? And here's what he says. Deuteronomy 30 verse 19. Today I have given you the choice between life and death, between blessings and curses. And now I call on heaven and earth to witness the choice you make. Oh, that you would choose life so that you and your descendants might live. You can make this choice. How do you do that? How do you choose life? How do you choose true life? You can make this choice, he goes on in verse 20, by loving the Lord your God, obeying Him, and committing yourself firmly to Him. This is the key to your life. And if you love and obey the Lord, you will live long in the land the Lord swore to give to your ancestors, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. They sit faced with this choice. And this, I just had to put this picture in because it looked like I drew it. I didn't. But right here is the promised land. And 40 years earlier, they were right here. They were as close to the promised land as King Og and all of these people over here. And they turned around, and that's pretty much what they did. They went round and round in circles. They didn't start the journey for 38 years, even north to cut across. And Moses says to a group of people, your parents chose death. Your parents chose to live an unfulfilled, lifeless life. God protected them. God provided for them. They still spent their life. They faced their share of battles, obstacles, and giants. But they never lived 1 second in the promise that God had given them. And now you guys, the children, because it was anyone under the age of 20. So many of these he's talking to, the leaders, had walked through all 40 years. They knew what life not in the promised land was like. They knew it was full of battles, obstacles, and giants. They knew that living where they were, they had first of all seen that it was no picnic either. You don't just call a truce. You just turn around and fight different giants that were behind you. They also had seen that God had given them victory in every impossible situation. He had brought water out of rocks. He had made donkeys talk. He had made them defeat 5 kings at once. He had had them strike down armies and giants, and over. In fact, that for 40 years, they had walked along. Their feet didn't hurt. Their clothes didn't wear out. Their food didn't run out, and they never lost a battle. And yet, they weren't one step closer to God's purpose for them than they had been 40 years earlier. And their parents never saw that purpose. And this is where it has been. This whole message started with a statement I made on the phone to a friend of mine. I would hate to find out, it seems like that all of the giants it seems like I've faced in the last few years have been on the way back to Egypt. I would hate to find out that what God put in my heart was so big and so fearsome and looked so gigantic that I never fought that giant, and in the meantime fought all the other ones. And there's an example I want to close with, and that is, in fact, I was going to use it Thursday night in Mandate. We didn't ever get to it, but and that is, and this is kind of a picture I felt like the Lord reminded me of. If you've ever flown, and most of you guys have, you know that when you take off from the ground, you first go through the lower part of the atmosphere where there are clouds and storms and things like that. And it's rough through there. There's a lot of turbulence in the lower area. And then ultimately, typically an airliner will cruise between 25, 30,000 and 40,000 feet. And they do this for several reasons. One of them is there's a whole lot less turbulence up there. And if you flew within the clouds and within the fog banks and the storms and everything else, you're constantly thrown around. Secondly, because the air is thinner, there's much less resistance, much less drag. So their fuel efficiency is much greater. They're able to travel much further on the same amount of energy. Third, their engines work much less. At 40,000 feet, a jet engine is running at just about idle speed to propel this plane at 600 or 700 miles an hour. It's not having to work nearly as hard. The pull, the drag against it. Along with the fact at 10,000 or even 20,000 feet, not only would it be turbulent, there are mountain peaks that if you flew over the Andes, you'd have a wreck, because they have several peaks over 20,000 feet. So you would encounter things that you would never see or never encounter at 30,000 feet. And it would be much harder work for the engines, for the plane. It would be much less comfortable. And as I was thinking about this, I really don't want to be killing giants that were never supposed to be on my path. I thought, it's like flying an entire trip at 15,000, 20,000 feet. Just being the whole time, turbulence, being shaken. You're going through it. If it's storming on you, and you're looking. There's no visibility because you're in clouds. You hit more bugs and things like that. Birds are an issue because they fly at those heights. They don't fly at the higher flights. And I thought of all these things, and I thought, is it possible that a lot of the turbulence in my life, maybe yours, is because the battles, the obstacles, the giants have made us go, I don't think I can fly at that height, and we've lowered our goals. We've lowered our expectations. We've lowered our vision. And we're flying. And I got to be honest, it's rougher and bumpier at 20,000 than 40,000. I want to challenge us as individuals to look at our lives this morning, to evaluate and say, what is that thing God has hidden in my heart? What is that thing I'm kind of embarrassed to tell other people because it sounds ridiculous. It sounds too big. And maybe it's for you as an individual. Maybe it's for your children, something you feel like God, a promise He gave you for them. Maybe it's for us collectively as a group. What is that individually, and what is that for us as a group? When we talk about On Your Six, and we talk about training and releasing indigenous pastors on all 6 civilized continents, sounds ridiculous. And so I have a tendency to quit talking about it. And yet it's what God put in my heart. But there's battles, obstacles, and giants between six continental training centers for pastors and right now. But I wonder, am I flying through a whole bunch of turbulence because it'd be real easy for my goals to slide down to balancing the budget? And that may be you personally. It'd be real easy for your goals to slide down to, can I just stabilize things? Can I tell you, flying at 20,000 feet, they don't stabilize. I feel like the Lord has kind of been saying that to me even this week. If you keep trying to fly at 20,000 feet, it's less efficient, it's slower, it's more turbulent, more obstacles reach that height, more bugs, more birds, more problems, and you go slower getting there. I feel like He's been saying to me, get your eyes up. And I feel like He might say that to some of you today. In your personal lives as well as for us as a group. Get your eyes up. Stop looking at maintaining. Stop thinking if I turn around and I forget about that thing God put in my mind, then I won't face battles, obstacles, and giants, because you do. And if you've made that turn, God's still with you. God will still provide. God will still protect. But the sooner, don't wait 38 years to turn and start back toward the promised land. The sooner you turn around and go, no, God said it. God can do it. We want to be a group of people who, if we're going to spend our lives, and everyone does, encountering from time to time battles, obstacles, and giants, we want to encounter them smack dab in the middle of the promise and the purpose that God has given us. Not over on the other side of the Jordan River, wandering around, fighting people that aren't even, Og, it wasn't even, they crossed down where it says Jordan about there, where Jericho is. They had to go out of their way to fight him. In fact, he got his whole army together and came and fought them just because they had beat up the Amorites. That's a battle that never should have happened. And I wonder how many battles I've fought that never should have happened, that were never on the path. And I wonder how many you have. Let's bow our heads for a moment. Lord, I pray that this was your word for us today. I pray it's a challenge to us. But really the challenge isn't for us to overcome, because you are the overcomer. The challenge for us is simply to believe. It's simply to take that big, gigantic thing that you've whispered into our hearts, into our minds, into our spirits, and to embrace it and say, I want to at least make sure every giant I fight is between me and Canaan, not between me and Egypt. Help us this morning, Lord. Help us to be bold. Help us, Lord, to believe that you can accomplish anything you have promised.